Welcome, everybody. My name is Ju Cheong, for those who don't know me, and I'm director of the Electoral Regulation Research Network. And I'm very excited today to have Dr. Victoria Shinneman from the University of Pittsburgh visiting our law school. She's doing she's doing a really sort of a speaking tour of the eastern seaboard of Australia. She's gone through Brisbane, just gave a talk in Adelaide, and after Melbourne we'll be off to Sydney and Canberra. And I think that in a way shows a level of interest, I think, and the exciting nature of her work. And her work is, and I hope I get this right in rough terms, it's been looking at electoral policies and its impact on voter participation, both in terms of the costs and benefits, and also I think connecting at a different level to sort of broader issues of trust and confidence in government. Mm-hmm. And today's talk, and Victoria is going to tell you much more about it, is really based on two natural experiments that she conducted that deal with this relationship between felon disenfranchisement and trust in the broader political system. So without further ado, I'll pass on to
Great,
Victoria.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming out. I'm really excited to share this project with you. So this is actually one of sort of a series of different papers as part of an umbrella project. But the one I'll present for you today is called Restoring Voting Rights Increases. Oh wait. Political engagement. Actually, that's the wrong title, but these are going to be the right slides. Okay. This is that's the title from another part of the project that I'll actually tell you about a little bit at the end. But what I'm going to talk about today is that restoring voting rights restores trust and cooperation in government. So sorry, that's the title from the presentation I gave at IPSA. But I get mixed up. But the rest of it should be spot on. All right, so if you're not familiar with American politics, I'll give you a little primer on felon disenfranchisement laws in the United States. So the U.S. is among one of the most punitive countries in the entire world. We have record numbers of people in prison. But beyond that, we are also unique in that we take away people's voting rights in almost every state while they're in prison. And in many states, we continue to restrict their voting rights even after they are released from prison. Right? So this is a map showing you a snapshot of the variation by state. Right? So the most dark blue states are the ones that are the most lenient. So for example, in the upper northeast, in Maine and Vermont, you never actually lose the right to vote. You can vote while you're in prison. You vote by mail. On the other sort of darker and lighter blue states, you can't vote in prison, but your right to vote is automatically restored at some point in time. In some states, right after you're released. Other states, only after you finish parole. And then others after you finish parole and probation. That could be 5 or 10 years later. And then the orange and reddish states are the most strict. And in those states, we'll have no automatic restoration of voting rights. The most extreme case is Florida, down in the southern right corner. So in the state of Florida, you have to complete your parole, your probation, wait 3 to 5 years, pay back all of your court fines, and then receive permission from a 5-member clemency board that includes the governor of the state. In the state of Florida alone, we have more than 10% of otherwise eligible citizens that don't have the right to vote. And a vast majority of those people are not in prison and have been released sometimes decades earlier. So in total, we have about 6 million US citizens who are denied the right to vote. It's about a quarter of the population of Australia, and it's about 2.5% of the population in the US. So previous research on these laws tends to focus in 3 areas, and I'm actually doing something different, but I'll tell you about what we know so far. So one big area is the racial motivation of the laws. So in the United States, we have this really terrible history where we used to deny voting rights to anyone who was not a white property-owning male. And as we've extended the right to vote, historically, there were also a lot of policies put in place to try to continue this de facto disenfranchisement of minority populations. So for example, having the poll tax or the literacy test. And so some people argue that these felon disenfranchisement laws, and there's actually text from old legislative debates, were actually put in place as an intentional way to disenfranchise minority populations who were legally required to vote. A second area of research is focusing on, regardless as to what the motivation of these laws was, what is the effect? And there's a huge racial disparity in the way these laws affect populations. Right? This is caused by both inequality in our education systems, in different communities, and also within the criminal justice system. Right? And so what we find is that non-white citizens are disenfranchised about 400% more than white citizens. And there are several states in the South where between 20 to 30% of black men do not have the right to vote because of these laws. Right, so there's a huge effect on non-white populations. And then the last big area of research thus far is focused on the electoral consequences. So people who have felony convictions, ex-offenders, tend to be from lower income groups, they tend to be from disadvantaged populations, and demographically those are all predictors that make people more likely to support left-leaning parties. So there's been a number of simulations and academic studies trying to estimate if we didn't restrict these votes, how would that have affected electoral outcomes? And not surprisingly, they found that not only would many local and statewide elections, but even a number of federal elections, including U.S. Senate races and the U.S. presidential races, would have had different outcomes if these 6 million people were not denied the right to vote. So in this project, I'm looking at something a little bit different. And what I'm focusing on is the effects of being disenfranchised on the people who are being disenfranchised, right, at the individual level. And in a nutshell, what I'm arguing is that when we restore people's voting rights, right, or when we give ex-offenders or prisoners voting rights, it leads to an increase in pro-social and pro-democratic attitudes. And all of these are linked to successful reentry and lower rates of recidivism. This idea of once most people in prison will be released from prison. And I don't know how it is in Australia, but most people released from prison in the US, a lot of them end up going back to prison. So we have a really invested interest in trying to figure out how can we encourage people to have the resources they need to successfully reintegrate into society. And what I'm arguing in this project is that when we take away people's voting rights, we're creating the very types of attitudes that make people less likely to have successful reentry. So I'll walk through the theory a little bit, and then I'll tell you about this really cool experiment that I just finished a few months ago. So the overview of the theory is that when we restore voting rights, we're restoring trust. Right? And so what do I mean by political trust? So by trust in government, we just mean trust in democratic institutions and actors. And there's a lot of implications that we might have when we think about trust. So first of all, when people trust the government, they're more likely to obey the laws that the government put in place because they feel legitimate. And that means that it's more efficient for government because you don't have to spend as much money monitoring people and enforcing laws and punishing people. Right? So trust is more efficient for government overall. It also affects the nature of participation. So people with low levels of trust are more likely to do anti-system types of participation, things like protest or boycott, where people who trust the legitimacy of the democratic system are more likely to engage in institutionalized participation, things like political parties or voting in elections. And it can also affect vote choice. If you have low trust in the political system, you're more likely to vote for anti-system, extremist, kind of fringe candidates, and that can lead to political instability. Right? And then lastly, as I spoke about a little bit before, there's a link between political trust and believing in the system, wanting to follow those laws, and being involved in the community, which is linked to successful reentry and recidivism. So I'd argue that there's a link between voting rights and trust in government, and there's actually two different pathways. So the first pathway is, right, when I restore your voting rights, or if you continue to have the right to vote, it's going to make you more likely to vote. And just voting in elections itself causes people to have increased trust in elections. And a number of my previous projects have found this effect with a non-prisoner, non-ex-offender population. So we can think of, like, there's lots of policies that, like, components of electoral systems that affect the costs and incentives to vote. So in my previous research, I focused a lot on things that increased incentives or decreased costs. So what I'm sure you're all very familiar about, since we're in Australia, compulsory voting is a prime example of something that increases turnout. We also have things like voter turnout lottery, access to convenience voting, things like vote by mail, being able to vote early, voting on a weekend, being able to register right when the election happens. All of those I've found in previous research increase trust. Yeah, clarification?
Why don't you have voting on the weekend?
That's a great question. So yeah, in the U.S. Constitution, when it was first formed, it says federal elections will happen on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November in even number years. And that was picked in the 1700s, and we've just never changed it.
And you don't feel the need to change it?
I think we absolutely should change it, right? So there are some states that have early voting. It varies by state. So in some states, for a weekend or two, or sometimes 3 before the election, you can show up at City Hall or the election office and vote early, but it's up to the states which ones offer that. Yeah, in America, we have elections on a Tuesday. Every democracy we've advised since, we advise people to do it on a weekend. right? I think if we were forming our country today, we would do weekend voting, but it's really hard to change a system. Working in election reform is one of the most difficult types of policy to reform, in my opinion, because you need the people in power to change the system that put them in power, right?
So how does it work when you vote on a Tuesday? Do you take time off from work?
You can. So the polls are open from, it varies by state, usually like around like 6 or 7 a.m. till about 9 p.m. So they try to make it available sort of before and after standard working hours. But for some people, you might be working all those hours. You can request a vote by mail ballot, but those rules also vary by state. Right? Some states, anybody can vote by mail. Other states, you have to sign a legal affidavit swearing that you're not able to vote and submit that maybe 15, 30 days before the election.
Would you think that more people would turn out on the weekend than through the week?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I would think having a period of time during which people can submit their ballots to make it as convenient as possible. And I would think allowing people to vote by mail. One thing that's cool, like San Francisco, for example, you can drop off your ballot in any polling place in the city. Right, most places in the U.S., you have to go to the place right near where you live. And I remember once, like, they changed my polling site, so I went to where I thought I should vote. They're like, no, you got to go to this other place. Thankfully, I had a car and an extra half hour, so I was able to drive to this other place, wait in that line and vote. But not everybody's going to have that time. Right. So yeah, it's the variation across states in these sort of convenience voting is vast. Right. But I would support making voting as easy as possible, in my opinion. So I think all of these policies are going to increase turnout, and that's going to increase trust because people now feel like they're a part of the system. Right? Even if the candidate you vote for doesn't win, you've still engaged in the system, you've given legitimacy to the system, you've agreed to play the game, and that leads to sort of an increase in your trust and perceived legitimacy. So in this project, what I've been doing is switching over to the left side of the spectrum and looking at policies that either increase costs or decrease incentives to vote. So in some states, for example, you have to register 30 days before the election. And so there's a lot of people, they don't really hear about the election until right before it happens, and it's too late. Long lines at polling stations. Sometimes you might have to wait 2, 3, 4 hours in line to vote in some locations in the US. Non-competitive elections, strict voter ID laws, which affect both poor people and old people. And also even just things like weather. Right? We know that when it's rainy on the Tuesday when we have our elections, turnout tends to go down because everybody shows up less on a Tuesday. If y'all are teachers, you notice attendance is probably worse on bad weather days. Same thing happens with elections. And then the one I'm focusing on in this project is felon disenfranchisement laws, right? Where we're not just making it harder to vote, but we're actually taking away the right to vote and making it really hard in some cases to get that right back. So by increasing turnout, we're increasing trust, right? This red arrow kind of pathway. But then I would argue that there's a second direct connection between restoring voting rights and restoring trust. Even if I don't vote, just knowing that I have the right to vote, knowing that I'm allowed and encouraged and wanted to be a part of this political system makes me feel included and valued, right? That when somebody is disenfranchised, it creates this sense of otherness, this sense that they don't want you in the political system, which is going to make people feel detached. Right? And so that when we're taking people's voting rights away, that's going to cause them to not feel included and to have lower trust in the political system. So for both of those reasons, I would argue voting rights are causing people to become more trusting, and vice versa. Disenfranchisement would decrease trust. So there's a little bit of evidence about this in the past, but it's entirely based on correlation. So I'll tell you about the two studies that get cited all the time. The first is that, right, if we look by state, and compare the states that allow ex-offenders to vote and the states that don't, the states that allow their ex-offenders to vote have lower rates of recidivism than those that disenfranchise. But this is not necessarily causal because there's a lot of other policies that vary, right? States that let ex-offenders vote also have different policies with regard to training that you might get in prison or resources you might get upon reentry, right? It's, right, if you take a look at this map, it's not a random distribution of which states are letting people vote and which states are not. The second example that's cited a lot is that, actually, I did these in reverse order. That was 2. The second example, which is number 1 on this on the slide, is that in the states that allow ex-offenders to vote, so say like Maine or Vermont, those people who do vote go back to prison less often. Right? But again, that's correlational, right? The people that choose to vote in a voluntary system are different from the people who choose to abstain. So it might be these characteristics that caused me to vote, but are also the things that are going to cause me to be less likely to commit crime. So we would expect these relationships to exist, but they're not necessarily causal. And so we don't have any causal evidence as of yet until this project. So my goal in this project was to try to identify some sort of random increase in voting rights, right? So voting rights are not randomly distributed, but one thing that I think I had an opportunity to leverage is because of this huge variation, there is really high misinformation about what people's rights are. A lot of people don't know whether or not they have the right to vote. There was one study that was done, they found, I think, 30% of election office workers didn't even know, were not able to correctly state the voting rights for their state, right? So say, I move from Kentucky to Pennsylvania to Oklahoma to California, my rights are changing in every state, and you can't expect people to know this. So what I do in this study is I try to leverage that misinformation and try to randomly inform people that their voting rights have been restored among a population that didn't know they had the right to vote. So I'll give you a quick template of the experiment, and then I'll walk through it in a little bit more detail step by step. So basically what I did is I recruited this population of subjects, and these were all citizens whose right to vote had likely been restored, but might not know it yet, and I'll explain why in just a minute. And I recruited them to do a panel survey before and after the statewide election, and I asked them a bunch of political questions. And then some of them were randomly assigned to receive these treatments that provided information about the restoration of voting rights. And then in the analysis, what I do is I estimate the difference in post-election attitudes, comparing people who received the information that their rights had been restored to a comparable population that received a placebo treatment that didn't give that information. And the idea is that by randomly increasing information about voting rights that have already been restored, this allows me to estimate the effects of restoration in a way that nobody's been able to do before with this correlational evidence. So that if you read the paper, there's actually two experiments. I'm going to focus on one of them today. The first one was a pilot study I did in 2014 in Akron, Ohio, and it was more just trying to get proof of concept. It was my first time working with this population, and the results of the pilot were really promising. So from that, I was able to get a grant, and I used my sabbatical semester to do a bigger project. So I actually moved to Virginia during the fall of 2017, just this last term, and did this experiment. So the election was in November of 2017. Most states do their statewide elections in even number years, which is when we elect our president and our Congress, but there's a handful that do them in odd number years, and Virginia is one of them. So even though it was an odd number year, still on a Tuesday in November, they were electing their governor, their entire state legislative branch, and a bunch of local offices. And Virginia is a state where if you are convicted of a felony, you lose the right to vote, and you can only get it back. You have to be released from prison, finish your probation, and then get a special letter from the governor of the state through an executive order restoring your voting rights. So it was one of the most strict states in the entire country. But then, previous governor, his name is Terry McAuliffe, he was a Democratic Party governor in Virginia. In July 2016, he said, well, so I have the right to restore voting rights to 200,000 people, right? There's 200,000 people eligible to have me restore their voting rights. And every other governor's been waiting for them to apply, but I don't have to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to proactively restore voting rights to all 200,000 people in a single executive order. And he did this big press release, and he signed the order, and it was huge. Right, all of these nonprofit organizations were out in the streets spreading the word, and more than 13,000 people registered to vote in a matter of weeks. So this was the summer right before the 2016 presidential election. Right? This is the election where we elected Donald Trump. And Virginia is a swing state. Right? It's a really important state in the Electoral College. So given the partisan split in felon disenfranchisement incentives, the Republican Party panicked, and they challenged this executive order. And it was fast-tracked all the way to the state Supreme Court. So a month later, the state Supreme Court overturned the executive order. It was a split 4-3 decision. And what the court said is that the governor does actually have the right to restore voting rights to all 200,000 people, but he can't do it in one executive order. He has to sign 200,000 separate executive orders because he has to evaluate each person separately. So the court overturned the executive order, huge media buzz about how it was unconstitutional, and these 13,000 registrations were canceled, and those people received a letter saying, you're no longer registered to vote, you are once again disenfranchised. Governor Terry McAuliffe said, that's not the outcome I was hoping for, but I'll work with it. And he created a task force to process these 200,000 executive orders as quickly as he could. So before the deadline to register and vote in the presidential election, he'd restored rights to about 70,000 people. And before the deadline to register in the 2017 election, he'd restored about 150,000 out of the 200. So when those people had their voting rights restored, the governor would send a letter to their last known address with this really cool certificate of restoration, letting them know your rights have been restored. But the problem is it's an incredibly transient population. If you've ever worked with ex-offenders, they move around a lot. Over the course of my study, more than 30% of my subjects changed their phone number or address, right? So it was really hard to keep in touch with them. So a lot of people didn't get these letters, right? So you have this case where 150,000 people have just had their rights restored. But because it happened, then it's unconstitutional, then it was canceled, then some people are getting letters and some people are not getting letters. And it's this population with really high levels of distrust and suspicion about government in general. I thought it was a really cool case where you have a lot of people whose right has been restored, but probably don't know it yet. So that's why I moved to Virginia a couple months before this election and started my study. And I picked the city of Richmond. So if I work with hard-to-reach populations, which is complicated in a lot of ways because you're trying to find people who are off the books. Most get out the vote campaigns work from the voter registration list, but I'm looking for people that are not registered, that don't even know they have the right to register. So I tried to pick a city with a high concentration of ex-offenders. And I picked Richmond, which is right next to Henrico County, which has about 11% statewide of the ex-offender population. And then here's sort of the protocol. I'll walk you through step by step. So first thing was recruitment, which was interesting and creative. Basically, I posted ads for a money-making opportunity. Right? You get paid $25 for doing 2 surveys. Altogether, it was about an hour of their time, so they're getting about 3 times minimum wage. So it's really good money. But you had to have a felony and have completed your probation. And I tried to put these ads in places where potential subjects would be likely to see them. And that was a lot of places. So I went to places like churches, any place offering social services. I took out ads in newspapers and job forums, every free newspaper in the city. We put ads in corner stores, bodegas, liquor stores, laundromats, basically trying to target places in low-income communities where people would stumble across this flyer and maybe believe it's not too good to be true and agree to do the study. Okay. So any person who wanted to sign up would come, and I rented these offices. It's in the middle of downtown Richmond. I rented 3 offices in a row in this really fancy building with good security, so it felt like a very legit, sort of safe location for people to come. And they would show up and they would complete the first survey, and we were there every day for about 2 weeks. After they completed that survey, they would get randomly assigned to receive one of 3 different treatments, and they would get those treatments face-to-face right there in my office. And I'll tell you about those now. So the first treatment focused entirely on the restoration of voting rights. So I just sit down with the person and I would say, hey, you might not know this, but there's a really good chance your right to vote has already been restored. Right? Like, this is what the governor's doing. And I would just tell them what the governor was doing. I had all sorts of official government documents I could show them. Say, if you're willing, I can look it up online. It takes 15 seconds. So the governor had created this really cool website, official government seal. You just enter your name, date of birth, last 4 digits of your social security number, and literally in 15 seconds, you would find out if your right to vote had been restored. And a number of my subjects would find out right there in my office, sometimes after 20 or 30 years of being disenfranchised, that they had the right to vote. And people, it was really cool whenever that happened. But sometimes it'd be somebody who's in that 50,000 that wasn't restored yet. Okay? In that case, I would offer them this form. Right, so the governor said, I'm going to do all 200,000. And if you want, I'll put you at the top of the list. Right? If you fill out this 1-page form, you'll go to the top of the list and you'll be the next person we do. And so a number of subjects had not been restored, filled out this form, and by the end of my study, their voting rights had indeed been restored, and they got their certificate of restoration. Then there was a second treatment. The second treatment, I did everything I just described. I did all of the restoration stuff, but then I added a get out the vote component, where I sort of said, hey, there's this election coming up in a few weeks. Do you know if you're registered to vote? I can look it up. It takes 15 seconds. Again, there's this website. If they'd let me enter their information, I could verify if they were registered, make sure their address was current, tell them where their polling site was, things like that. If they weren't registered, I would offer them a voter registration form, offer to help them fill it out and submit it for them. Right? And people sort of engaged at all different levels of this process. Right? And then you need, right, so for any scientific experiment, you need a control group. Right? You need a group that is exactly like the population you're treating, except for the treatment. And I gave them a placebo treatment. So it didn't feel weird for them to come there, right? So it didn't feel like, why did you bring me here and then send me out? And what I did is I gave them an encouragement to volunteer and be active in their community. And I put together this packet of all sorts of upcoming volunteer opportunities. They were all nonpartisan, nonprofit. Here's, for example, like a walk for hunger. And just said, it's really, I'm really encouraging citizens to be active in their communities. So it's still a pro-social, pro-participatory message, but with no information whatsoever about voting rights, which hopefully allows me to really isolate the effect of knowing your rights have been restored. Okay. So in Virginia, you have to register 3 weeks before the election. So on the last day where you could register to vote, that's when the first part of the study ended. I stopped doing surveys. I waited 3 weeks. Right. Election day occurred, and then the second survey started 2 days later. Right. And subjects only got paid if they finished both surveys, and almost all of them did eventually complete both surveys. And anybody who completed both surveys received $25 for their time, which is a good amount of money. Right. Okay, you want to see results? So what I'll show you is, we'll say this is the figure you'll see in the paper, and I'll show you some more PowerPoint-friendly figures in a minute. In the paper, I divide it, so this is the effect of the restoration-only treatment. This was the restoration with the get out the vote. They were incredibly similar, and so I also pool them together, which is sort of this column on the right. And I'll show you some figures in a minute that are it's just more visually appealing depictions of what's on the right. And what I'm showing you is the difference pre-election versus post-election among people who found out their rights had been restored versus that difference of people who did not find out their rights had been restored. Right? So the difference in the increase in all of these different estimates of trust. Right? And they're all on a 0 to 100 point scale. Right? So if you start at 30 and you go up by 20, you ended up at 50. Right? So the first set of questions I asked, how much you trust each of the following groups. And these were all actors immediately involved in the election. And across the board, we find that trust goes up. So trust in the newly elected governor significantly increased. Trust in the newly elected state assembly, the state legislative branch, went up. The Virginia state government as a whole also went up. Trust in the local city government went up. As far as the old government, it makes sense that the old assembly trust wasn't affected because you just voted them out. And it also makes sense that trust in the old governor went up because he's the one that restored their voting rights. Right? He wasn't running for re-election, but it makes sense that they would now be more trusting of this person because they found out he was the one that proactively, single-handedly restored their rights. Right? So we do find that when people find out their rights have been restored, they are now more trusting of the government that's been elected. I also asked a series of questions about sort of perceived fairness and representation. So I was asking subjects whether you agree with the statement, I generally trust the U.S. federal government to make decisions in a fair way, or the U.S. federal government represents people like me. Right? And I had used both of those statements for both the federal, the state, and the local government. And we find almost across the board that the perceived fairness and perceived representation of the electoral system and of a democratic system go up when people find out that their voting rights have been restored. And then this is actually probably my favorite part of the study. This was something I found in the pilot that I hadn't originally predicted, but it made sense to me, that trust in the criminal justice system went up. And that makes sense, right? Because this is the system that imposed these penalties. And when you realize the penalties are not as bad as you thought they were, you become more trusting of the system that, right, allowed these penalties to be reversed. So in the second study, I went in with these as hypotheses and was able to replicate them in the second study. So when people found out their right to vote had been restored, their trust in the criminal courts and the Supreme Court go up, as well as the state Supreme Court. Also trust in the police. And then I added these two more questions where I asked, right, again, how much do you agree or disagree with the statement? I would feel comfortable calling the police for help if I was in danger or if I saw a crime being committed that harmed somebody else. And what I find is that when people find out the right to vote has been restored, they are more willing to cooperate with police when there's a time when the police are needed, right, which I think is a really striking effect.
Can I just ask what the numbers actually represent? So
Yeah. So on 100, this is the increase pre versus post on a 100-point scale. So for example, this one is like almost 20.
Yeah.
I can't remember what the baselines are. The baseline's anywhere from like 20 to 50, right? So if it went up by 20 points, maybe that means I went from an average of 30% trust in the police to an average of 50% trust.
Okay. But were the questions standardized or were they asked?
So they were all on a 1 to 7 scale,
Okay.
right? So it's
Yeah.
agree versus disagree.
Sure.
And I rescaled them from 0 to 100 just to make it easier to compare magnitude. That's that. So then the question is like, so one critique I'd gotten in the pilot, or when planning this, right, workshopping the design, is like, well, how do you know that they're not just becoming trusting of everything and everyone, right? How do you know that it's government? And so what I did is I added a bunch of decoy questions to make sure that wasn't happening. And so I asked about their trust in other actors. So how much do you trust the fire department and the media and your neighbors and your coworkers and other ex-offenders? And although they're all positive on average, none of these are statistically significant within a 95% threshold. Right? So it's not that people became trusting of the whole world, they became trusting of the government being elected, the government they were allowed to participate in, and the criminal justice system that had restored their voting rights. Right? So the selective increases in trust, I think, goes a long way to supporting the theory behind what's actually happening in this project. So there's a bunch of other papers, well, not a bunch, but there's a few other papers coming from this project. I've also found evidence that when we restore voting rights, it leads to an increase in political efficacy, believing that you can make a difference, believing that you have political power, people saying that they're more likely to vote in the future or more interested in participating in the future, and also political information. Subjects who were treated became more informed, paid more attention to the campaigns, and were more informed about the electoral outcomes. So those are in separate papers, and I'd be happy to share them with you or talk about it if you're curious. Plus also there's increases in registration and turnout, but I'm more interested in sort of these downstream effects. So just to sort of summarize the results, right? So previously, up until now, there's these known effects of felon disenfranchisement laws, right? We're reducing turnout. We've got more than 6 million people nationwide who do not have the right to vote. It's disproportionately affecting minority communities, and it's distorting electoral outcomes. But a lot of those reasons are tricky because they're embedded in old school racism, in partisanship, in a lot of vested interest. Okay? What I think is really cool about this project is it's showing these new effects of felon disenfranchisement laws, right? Where that when we're restoring voting rights, we're increasing trust in government, trust in the police and the criminal justice system, increased cooperation with law enforcement, and also increases in efficacy, political information, and future participation. And all of those are linked to successful re-entry and lower rates of recidivism. And so I think the implications are I'll put them in a sort of threefold category. So first of all, this study is replicating a lot of my previous studies with a new population. Right? So in the past, I've showed that when you increase turnout, you cause all of these things to go up. And so I'm finding, right, again, that we can increase trust, information, efficacy, and participation with a different sort of twist in the electoral system, with a completely different population in a different electoral setting. So that's just robustness for the overall finding that I'd found before. Also, it's expanding these downstream effects. In this paper, there's 2 new sets of outcomes that I hadn't looked at before. People have been saying this for years, but we've never had scientific evidence that when you restore voting rights, it leads to an increase in trust in the criminal justice system and a greater willingness to cooperate with government and with the police. And I think the normative implications are huge with regard to crime prevention. These policies are difficult in the U.S. particularly. I'm not sure what the breakdown would be in Australia, but in the U.S. it's an incredibly partisan issue, right? Because the stakes for the 2 main political parties are so high, it's really hard to find common ground on this issue. But both parties are really in favor of crime prevention, and there's a lot of coalitions happening, bipartisan coalitions happening, trying to sort of figure out how can we get better reentry and lower rates of recidivism. And because so many of these pro-democratic, pro-social attitudes are predictors of successful reentry and recidivism, I feel like this project can speak to people on both sides of the political aisle, and I hope that it can inform public opinion and policy in that direction. So that's it. So I really look forward to your comments and questions.